we have a shell game with the ICBMs. We'll have a field somewhere out in Montana or Idaho or whatever. We'll have a whole lot of silos around a little circle. We will have an underground railroad train, and this train will run around on a random schedule and put the missile in a different silo. And therefore, there's no way the Russians can get that. They'd have to take out all the silos with extreme accuracy. So that sounds like a good project for ESP man. So we did study. I decided to do a study on that. What is the vulnerability of that system to remote viewing detection techniques? Well, it turned out that there was a simulation that was being done by one of our consultants. It was just sort of like a video ESP game, where on the screen were 10 circles to represent 10 possible targets. They were chosen by a random number generator. And then the individual, of course none of them were lit up, had to push a key on the keyboard to say which number target she thought was the target. And it turned out that with 10 circles, you'd expect 1 in 10. In fact, her hit rate was 1 in 4. And we were using a very sophisticated statistical procedure where we did many trials to find it. And to make a long story short, she did 500 trials, and from that 500 trials, she got 12 out of 12 right. No misses. The probability of doing this result by chance is 1 in a trillion. So, of course, we were very excited about that. We briefed our Air Force contract monitor. He said, well, you know, there's a group down in Norton Air Force Base whose job it is to try to figure out whether the Russians can come up with ways to defeat this shell game situation. You should go down and brief them. So we did. They were doing all kinds of neat things, like telemetering cockroaches, because the cockroaches would go to the missile, the silo that had the missile in it, and all that kind of thing. Anyway, they thought this was great, and they started briefing it up the chain. This was not happy news for the hierarchy in the Air Force, because the Navy was coming on strong with its nuclear missiles. SAC bombers were kind of getting passé. They didn't like to hear this. So they put a lot of red tape around it, a lot of classification, and disbanded the group at Norton Air Force Base. That's the way it goes. Another thing that occurred during the Carter administration, if you recall, was the Iranian hostage situation. There are many times during that whatever 100 numbers of days where Ayatollah Khomeini would say, I'm going to release a hostage. So the White House would get all excited. They'd send people out, send a medical team over to Frankfurt ready to, examine the hostage and so on, and nothing would happen. Cry wolf, cry wolf, cry wolf. Well, this had happened so many times that whenever you would say that, nobody paid any attention. By that time, we were working directly for a fellow in the National Security Council. And he heard that Khomeini had said he's going to release another hostage. So he decided just to check it out. And so he had us target on an individual to get a physical, medical, and psychological profile. This is something we did all the time, usually a head of state or whatever. We never knew who the target person was. I mean, I know it sounds crazy, because it is crazy, I guess. He would say, I've got a name written on an envelope in my breast pocket here in Washington, D.C. I just want you to tell me about that person. I have to admit that even after 13 years of doing this, every time I launched into an experiment, I'd say to myself, what am I doing here? This can't possibly work. In this case, he gave a physical description that mentioned, our remote viewer gave a physical description that mentioned, that matched the person that Khomeini said he was going to release. He gave a psychological profile that was also accurate. And he gave a medical condition and said, this fellow is so sick, he should be in a hospital. And yet in a few days I see him on a plane. And the vertigo alone practically kills him. So anyway, we turned that data over to our National Security Council guy, and he said, well, this thing about being on a plane, maybe he is going to be released. So for the first time in a long time, they did send a medical team one more time to Frankfurt. And in fact, the hostage was released. He had multiple sclerosis, and the stress of being a hostage was really doing him in. Khomeini did not want a dead hostage on his hands. Eventually, the national security guy went and sat down with ex-hostage and said, I have a source here, meaning our remote viewer, that I can't reveal, but I always like to calibrate my sources. Let me just read what he said. And as he started reading the transcript, he could see that ex-hostage Queen was getting more and more irate. And finally, Queen jumped up out of his chair and said, the only way you could have had that data was if my guard was your source, and if that was the case, why didn't you get me out of there sooner? Pat Price, the one who did the crane, the one who did the swimming pool complex, he was good enough that the CIA just finally hired him outright, and he went to work for them, targeted on some foreign embassies, successfully described the interiors and location of code rooms. The operations officer concluded, it's my considered opinion that this technique, whatever it is, offers definite operational possibilities. Well, what do some other people say about the program? I mean, I've been bragging about it, but what do other people say? Well, at least the CIA admitted they had such a program. Here's one we were told would never see the light of day because it was controlled by the Air Force and they did not want people to know how good remote viewing was at this time. But after President Carter got out of office, he was giving a speech to students in a Georgia university, and some students said, well, what was one of the more unusual things that you experienced as president? He said, well, one time there was a plane that went down in Zaire, and we wanted to find it. It was a Soviet electronics plane, and spy satellites couldn't locate the wreckage because it was down under the jungle canopy. And so my CIA director, Stansfield Turner, turned to remote viewers, actually two, and we found where it was, and we went in and we got it. And that was true. Meanwhile, Major Thompson, Army Chief of Staff for Intelligence, was briefed by us, and he decided to set up a program within the Army Intelligence Group at Army INSCOM. Finally, in this history that got declassified in 1995, they finally admitted that the DoD paranormal psychology program had done more than 200 tasks, operational military organizations, applying remote viewing to obtain information available from other sources. As the program began to get declassified, this began to come out. Give an example of what came out of this group. My fourth row attendee here, Joe McMonigal, his wife Scooter. There are dozens. In fact, you should see his books to see descriptions of many of them. But in one case, which is particularly striking, he was given the coordinates of a location. It was sort of a big building on the land somewhere. And he described that they were building a submarine. Not only was it a submarine, it was the largest submarine there could possibly be. And not only that, but it was full of slots for missiles to come out of. And at the time, I guess I won't name names, people said this is nonsense, can't possibly be. Besides, this is on the land. Well, it turned out that they were building this submarine out of titanium, the largest submarine in the world, on land, and when it came time to launch the submarine, they had to go in and carve a channel out of the land so the submarine could reach the water. And indeed, there it is. Joe was given a Legion of Merit Award. This is about the time the Cold War was running down. There was a lot of skepticism in the press, and people saying, well, they didn't really do all that much, and so on. So I'm glad to see that Joe was willing to let this come out into the open. And they provided 200 missions, Joint Chiefs of Staff, DIA, NSA, CIA, Secret Service, producing crucial and vital intelligence unavailable from any other source. So the program was successful. You might think now that since the program closed down, interest is lost. It was always tough to keep it going. Heads of agencies come and go, and then they say, well, what is this program I've got? Well, do we really need that? And as the Cold War wound down, it was hard to keep it going. So the program stopped as a large program. But still, there continued to be interest in it. I was asked to write up a history of the program, which there are copies for you out there. In this case, a commander for the Navy SEALs said, you know, Navy SEALs should be trained in this. And so we arranged for him to interview me and my colleagues and our sponsors, and he wrote a thesis for the Marine War College about how Navy SEALs should be trained in this. So the interest continues. Okay, that's all heavy, military, intelligence, and all that. Well, let's end this discussion with some fun things for us. Where does it apply in our lives? Well, the best place to start on that is something called the Skytop Lodge experiment. Some parapsychology researchers got the idea that since apparently normal people can do this, maybe we're all using ESP all the time and just don't know it. So they actually arranged to go to a meeting of 67 corporation presidents, and they asked them to guess a 100-digit random number before it's chosen. And the chance expectation was that you could get 10% of the individual digits right. What they found was that although the group as a group scored a chance, all but one of those presidents whose companies doubled profits in the previous 5 years scored above chance. All but one of those presidents who did not double profits scored below chance. And this sort of seemed to support the hypothesis that this was running underground with these corporation presidents. They then interviewed the corporation presidents. What do you think about ESP? What do you think about psychic phenomena? I don't believe in that stuff. But I have learned to go by my intuition, my gut feel, and that's why I'm successful. Well, they even ended up, that's in a book, in case you want to read about it, called Executive ESP. Okay, I'll end on a couple more view graphs, and then we're done. As you can imagine, we had skepticism all the time. And of course, most of the stuff while we were doing it couldn't be talked about. So we're sort of in the position of having a bunch of physicists saying you can't make atomic bombs, and meanwhile you're blowing them up in the desert. And the skeptics would always say, if these people are so psychic, why aren't they rich? Why don't they go to Las Vegas? Why aren't they in the stock market? Well, we finally got an answer to that. Actually, many of them were, but keeping it very quiet. My wife and I at this time happened to be behind setting up of a private primary school, and we had the teachers hired. They had 100 kids enrolled. It was August. One of our funders of $25,000 contribution dropped out at the last minute, so we didn't know what we were going to do. What I'm going to tell you now is something that every one of you can actually go home and use. You should try it. I went to a wealthy dentist, and I said, well, you know, we have this, we lost a funder and so on. He said, now wait a minute. I know you. You have that ESP program at SRI, don't you? And I said, yes. He says, well, tell you what. I'm not going to give you money,